In the days before the general use of coal, before the idea of the combustion engine, in the time when the power and the strength was in the land, there was unity of life upon the countryside. Not so long ago, it was usual for the countrymen to see in the early autumn coveys of partridges, family groups, as they fed under the ever-watchful eyes and guiding voices of the parent birds. Today, over several parts of England, the common or grey partridge is on the verge of extinction as a breeding species. This is a story of how the partridge and other wildlife have been affected by some of the changes that have come so dramatically upon the countryside. 5,000 miles of hedgerows are grubbed up each year by farmers in England, claims the Nature Conservancy. The need is for larger fields, wherein to operate their fast, heavy machinery. 5,000 miles of English hedges going every year. It's rather sad, I think. But I've been a farmer. I know the anxieties of getting your ploughing done in the autumn before the frosts come, particularly on heavy land like this, which is like plasticine. As I said, I've been a farmer. I've lain in bed at night wondering if the weather would keep well because we were late with our ploughing after taking up the sugar beet. And therefore I can understand the point of view of the farmers. So out with the hedgerows, on with bigger and easier fields to work with bigger and better machinery. And damn the sentimentalists of the town. Let them come and sweat it out in the fields and learn better. That, I fancy, must be the attitude of some farmers today. In 1936, when I bought my farm in Norfolk, 240 acres, land was cheaper than it had been for 150 years. I paid £8 an acre and was told by my valuer that it was too much. And today you can see where I left my mark on the farm. The outline of a barn owl in red brick embedded in our new concrete yards. Hello, I say, my name's Williamson. I'd forgotten this owl when we put this up in 1937. We all the concrete slabs, you know, yes. We brought them in and yes. The cement board came down yes. And cement man, so I said, good. By the way, are you Douglas?
Yes, I'm Douglas.
Well, you were a boy when I left, you remember, 25 years ago?
Yes.
You worked in my, and you're still
yes.
here?
Yes.
What are you, head cowman?
Yes.
I see all your lovely Pigeons yes. on the whole hills up there.
Yes. Because
it's very different today, you know, from what it was in the 30s when farming was in a tremendous slump. And they said only mugs bought land. Now, when we first came from Devon to North Norfolk in the mid-30s, the farm was in a very sorry state indeed. The 100-odd arable acres had been badly let go, as the saying was. The fields were weedy, and the barley crops yielding less and less grain every year as the humus was sucked out and replaced by artificial fertilizers which were no substitute, especially in a dry climate. But the well-placed woods held many wild pheasants, while the fields were the home of their little brown bird, the partridge. 5 meadows of grazing behind a sea-wall were snipe bogs. The draining dikes, or grups, were grown thick with reeds the home of many wild birds. I needed capital to reclaim the neglected farm, so after the day's work I wrote about my experiences. The 17th century granary was our home in those early days. It served as farm office as well as writer's study. Many of my articles and broadcasts were the basis of the story of a Norfolk farm. This passage shows the difficulty I had in constantly changing from writer to farmer. For 20 years my mind had been set to create imaginatively. In my mind I could create a field of corn out of a wilderness. I could make a word picture of it. The silky grey-green wind wave of midsummer barley, the rustle of yellowing oats, the stiffer sway of wheat, the lark singing in the sky, and the kestrel shadow moving down the grass of the windy hill. But it was one thing to race ahead of the present and anticipate my mind's desires, and another to see, as I did on my farm all the time, the dereliction, the dilapidated buildings, swampy meadows, flat gates, and overgrown hedges. Sometimes I found reality temporarily unbearable. The gulf between aspiration and reality was too great. In reclaiming the farm, I was determined to follow the plan of the old four-course Norfolk shift, when fertility was maintained by the dung of bullock, pig and sheep. The bullocks were kept during the winter in yards littered with straw, where the 2-year-olds were fattened for beef. By April, each yard contained, when the stock went on the meadows, about 2 feet of rich, dark muck, well rotted, full of potential plant food. When spread evenly, 10 tons to the acre, the field was ploughed and cultivated. Wheat or oats must be drilled by Old Michaelmas Day, the 11th of October, to assure an established plant before the starling flocks, several millions of them, come across the North Sea. Otherwise the wheat bulbs would be milky, and that was what the starlings were after. As soon as the corn sheaves had been carried, the stubble was cultivated, torn up to make a rough seedbed for weeds to grow. These weeds were then ploughed under, and the field was ready for the following crop, sugar beet, which we drilled in early spring. Our small ewe flock was fed on the sugar beet tops left on the field to wilt. How true the old saying, the sheep is a walking dung cart. We tried to get the sheep off before the November frosts, for to plough under half-frozen furrows would delay, through cold, the growth of the next crop, barley. and thus the 4-year cycle maintained the fertility of the arable. After barley had been sown, small seeds, clover, ryegrass, sainfoin, trefoil, were drilled across the pale green lines of corn, which acted as nurse to the small seeds, protecting the hay to be. And when August came and the barley was cut and carried, the small seeds grew up to become next season's hay, which was fed to the horses in the stable and all our beasts in the yards. Such was, with chopped turnips in place of sugar beet tops, the original Norfolk 4-course shift, originated by Turnip Townsend, one of the great Norfolk landowners who had brought back the seed from the Marlborough Wars in Flanders, where he had seen cattle kept alive through the winter on such tack. Before then, cattle in England were slaughtered in October, when grazing was over, and salted down in tubs. We had horses when we started here, and I did a little bit of ploughing sometimes, but I never got as far as 1 acre a day, as a good ploughman would do on medium soil. But I did notice the great contentment of a ploughman who was proud of his horses and proud of driving the straight furrow. And at the end of his 8 hours, he'd probably in medium land have completed 1 acre, and then he went home and he fed his horses, watered them first, of course, and then in the evening his leisure had been earned and he was a contented, happy man like that. It was a wonderful feeling to work with horses, to plough with a single furrow plough, following 2 of our draft horses plodding ahead, the swingle trees swaying as the traces or chains tightened, the wave of earth rearing up and turning over with the soft whisper of the share, and the bright breast of the plough gleaming like a curved sunflower petal. We ploughed also by tractor, a new invention in those days. Little grey dicker, or donkey, our 1937 Ferguson tractor was called in the village. With luck, our ploughing was done before the long thrust of Siberian air came in over the North Sea. Later it snowed, and in the morning we looked out on a new world. Frost to expand the furrows, nitrogen in snow to aid fertility. What a joy it was in those days to move over one's own land on skis, everything going well. How were the partridges faring upon the white fields? I watched a covey digging for sugar beet tops. Poor fare for them, but they were hardy and resourceful. Others were on the newly turned plough, still more on the stubbles. We scattered tail corn to help them through a period of increasing white desolation. That was far away and long ago, 2 years before the start of the Hitlerian War. Today there's no more ploughing with horses, no more sheaves to be set up in stooks, no loading or carting, no corn ricks. The combine harvester thrashes as it roars around a field. And when it's gone, there lies only a frass of straw to be burned. Everything is now done by machinery. Tractors have 6, 7, and 8 ploughs in line. Little grain for the partridge to feed on. Nothing for shelter in the winter. Today most farms, or groups of farms, are run not so much for a way of country living as a way of profits. And as I've said, and I repeat, if barley after barley is cropped, with only artificials added, this can result in only one end, damage to the soil structure, to Mother Earth, by which all things come into being. But to my Norfolk farm in the late 30s. The hedges which Dick Curzon and I had cut and laid in the autumn were now, in the spring, snowy with blossom. The fresh smell of the stirring earth was born with the wind, for suddenly 2 hares began to leap around and to chase each other madly to and fro across the rows of sprouting barley. Loveliest is the time when summer is coming in, and down in the meadows the sedge warbler sings all the love in his heart. Off he flits, joining the host of other birds searching for insect food. We had a swing by the pond, long since rotted, and all day house martins came and went, loading beakfuls of mud. Brilliant little nest builders. Away speeds one bird as another comes in for his load of mortar. The pond is still a great meeting place for birds, and at any time of the day is thronged with blackbirds, finches, pipits, thrushes. How birds love the water. I watched a long-tailed tit gathering insect food. Think of the infinite labour that goes into her nest, mosses, horsehairs, lichens, and hundreds of feathers, each individually gathered and woven into a warm, all-enveloping cradle. One year, near the farm buildings, a robin had nested in an empty coconut shell, only to be duped by a cuckoo. For the cuckoo is a bird which, like a human courtesan, appears to accept the delights of mating while avoiding the burden of responsibility, which it puts upon other birds. While walking over the lands of my old farm, I found a partridge's nest on a rough bit of grazing we knew as Spong Brick. And in the clump of thistles, and I've got to go very carefully, is a hen partridge sitting on perhaps 14 or 15 eggs, and they are likely to hatch within the next 24 hours. Now, she is in front of me, and I'm upwind, and she may get scent of me. But she's a very brave bird, and they sit very tight. Now, the cockbird usually calls her off about this time for food, watching for crows in the sky who are their enemies. But today he's unusually silent. He's at the edge of the next barley field, I think, watching. And she is before me, probably listening to my words. So I must now go away and creep as quietly as I can, downwind, so as not to disturb them. It was about this time of year when we cut our hay. A pair of Suffolks opened up the field around each side, drawing the mowing machine, while a sea-green wave of ryegrass and clover overcurled and lay still in the sun. The driver, on the iron seat, watched the standing stalks before him, ready to stop should a partridge fly up ahead of the cutting knife. If he saw one, he stopped the machine, marked the nest, and cut round it. What a contrast today, with the flail cutter and the driver in his cab unable to see if a bird flies up from its nest in front of him. After 3 years of intensive reclamation work, my farm in 1940 was classified as an A farm. I was surprised at this, having rated myself a Z farmer. So I took a day off and wandered idly about my land. Down at Lark's Bush Meadow, my eastern boundary, was a small peninsula, 2 acres of alder, ash, blackthorn and willow, by the river where otters had a holt. Lying down on the bank, I found myself staring into 2 whiskered faces with small currant eyes. I kept still. Later, the bitch otter appeared with a fish. She swam past me and, quite heedless of my presence, went straight to the cubs, dropped the fish, then set off on another hunting expedition. At the other boundary of the farm, the brook that ran through my property was badly polluted. One day I told myself it must be cleared up. One day. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. My son, Robert, and I looked at it recently. And of course the worst pollution of all is in the cow houses up the river, where they wash them out with chlorine, because that knocks the fish straight out. Just as I remember some of our chaps in April 1915, when the Germans let off chlorine gas. You see, had no masks. What they did, some of these chaps put their handkerchiefs in the trench they had it, and they'd urinate on them and hold it before their noses for a little while, but in the end they got it. When they died, their faces were swelled up in plum colour. Well, that's chlorine, and that's the deadly enemy of all rivers.
Yes. This river's still got some of the flannel weed in, though. That
Yes, I noticed that. That is owing to excessive nitrogen, which means sewage.
Yes.
And at any rate, it isn't so bad as it was when we first came here, and they're doing their best to clean it up. And I think they'll end. I'm an optimist, in spite of my experience. I think in the end they'll have their beautiful chalk stream back with sea trout in, and 3 or 4 pound trout.
Yes.
Oh, I'm very glad to see it's looking much better than our time.
There are swallows still nesting under the bridge when we were building this sluice, Henry. And while you've been talking, I've been watching them. And they're still there. I don't suppose they're the same ones, but there are some coming in now.
Well, you know, the swallows come back, if they survive, to the very place of their birth.
Yes.
They have something in them, all migratory birds.
Yes.
But we don't know what it is yet. And I watched them under that bridge there. I'm very glad they're back. And it was good to see that the kingfisher had returned as well, drawing a line of azure blue as it flew downstream to feed its young in a tunnel under the bank. Kingfishers are, like most birds, fastidious, washing after each visit to the nest before speeding off for more fish. But oh, the nest at the tunnel's end smells like Caliban in Shakespeare's Tempest. And this summer, we found a hen kestrel who had her nest on a ledge at the top of an old windmill in the marshes nearby. 2 irises were raised. I felt myself to be behind the hen bird's piercing eyes, which felt and revealed the shock of any sudden movement that interrupted the feeding of its young. There was another kestrel nesting within a few yards of a jay's nest. When the young jays were left unattended, the kestrel flew over to feed and then later brood the smaller nestlings. Rabbits were great pests in the old days. When I arrived in North Norfolk, I used to see on my Hall Hills, a parkland of a dozen acres, as many as 200 rabbits feeding together in the early summer evening. I detested them. They poisoned the grazing of the hills with their droppings and cut down the growing corn 50 yards in depth from the edge of the woods. In the granary of my Norfolk farm, there were many sparrows. They fed on the spilt corn that leaked from rat holes in the sacks waiting to be taken away by lorries to the railway station. There was a plague of mice as well. Weasels followed them in, playing a deadly game of hide and seek. Then there were pigeons, many of them migrants from over the North Sea. They were our enemies too. I had the young clover and ryegrass of one of my fields almost shaved by their pickings. Sparrowhawks took a few, but more pigeons came in great flocks. A neighbour had all his kale, a cabbage-like plant for feeding to cows, plucked bare. After pigeon shooting one day, I saw a curious sight, a dog fox jumping frantically up and down. Then I remembered a bird that one of the villagers had winged and been unable to retrieve. The fox, I was standing downwind, got the pigeon, and good luck to it. It may have been the same dog fox who sired 2 cubs during the following spring in our hang-high wood. I often saw them playing together, wrestling in dim-it light, while the dog fox himself loped across through the adjoining fox-cover wood, watching for an unwary rabbit. In such a way was the balance of nature maintained. The gamekeeper upsets this natural balance by trapping stoats, weasels, magpies, jays and crows. But ironically, without him, birds such as the partridge would almost certainly not survive. And I suppose pheasants are a sort of crop, shot between the beginning of October and the end of January.
Yes. Have a lap. And again. And again.
The enemies of small birds are owls, crows, hawks, weasels, stoats, rats, magpies and jays. But as the half-century of our time and civilization was reached, science took a hand, or a claw, as the great killer, by means of organochlorine weed killers which was sprayed mechanically on growing crops.
One year we had on what I thought was a weed-free field a tremendous lot of yellow charlock. I asked the stockman how ever it came there, and he says, "Reckon it went down wormholes, master. You've been deep ploughing for sugar beet and you've turned it all up." And he told me that the shot-like seed had a very oily and hard skin, and it could last so long as from the Battle of Waterloo. So I said, "Well, how do we get rid of it?" He says, "Well, this new spraying's just come in. It was the year 1946. I reckon Major Boxer Henthorpe, he's cleared his off."
Tractor and spraying equipment arrived one morning. The new chemical, I learned later, was DNC. It was supposed to destroy redweed, poppy, charlock, and all other weeds. Men working with this and similar outfits were warned not to touch their food with yellow hands, but to hold the sandwiches between bits of paper. The mixture of DNC and sulfate of ammonia, spraying increases your crop, said the advertisement. Killed 2 Irishmen who had ignored the warning. It also killed a pair of partridges with their newly hatched chicks. I came across the 2 birds, crouched side by side in death, with their chicks slightly larger than humblebees, cold between the protecting feathers. Other little families escaped, the chicks following their parents, now and then stopping to pick up small insects and to peck timorously at leaf and flower. They wanted the liquid in the leaves to drink. Then one night it rained hard, and in the morning I saw on Spong Breck, one of our fields, a minute partridge chick, sticky clay bawling on each hind claw. It was lying exhausted and feeble, while the stronger chicks followed the hen under the watchful eye of the cockbird. That was 25 years ago, and my recent return during July was alienating, for I saw the bottom of hedges sprayed to burn off wild flowers, weeds to the robot-minded, flowers to me, which if left alone would have offered nectar for bees and other pollinating insects. Thus pollination of crops is liable to be aborted, especially in wind-waving fields, growing clover and other small seeds for hay. By the end of July, the partridge chicks were strong. Their feathers were now more distinctly striped, and they could flap their wings enough to almost lift themselves off the ground. It was a hard life when I was farming, but an honest one in the sense that there was satisfaction felt by extending the muscles of the body every day. "One must use hands," said T. Lawrence to me one day long ago. It is probable that the old farm workers had more real skills than the average worker today, who spends his working life on machines. I suppose that today's farm machinery is a time saver as it goes ripping and roaring over the fields. But the machine is not an extension of the modern farm worker's skill, as were the old tools and horse machines of my youth and middle age. If way to the better there be, it enacts a full look at the worst. wrote Thomas Hardy in a preface of his last poems, with their steady vision of the sufferings of humanity when nature is injured by secondary ambitions of money-making, at whatever cost to health and happiness. Secondary interests, anything for money. I know two men in the West Country, masons by trade, who until recently spent much of their leisure time digging out badgers, only because the pelts, the hairs, the expensive shaving brushes, are worth up to £5 each. The old saying, if we don't get 'em, somebody else will, was the world's wisdom for them. Where there is no vision, the people perish, was something the parson said. And they said, wasn't he paid to say it? That was truth to them. After the Hitlerian War, when I had sold my farm and returned to North Devon and my writing, the general use of other sprays on arable and grasslands caused the deaths of a great number of birds, including such predators as sparrowhawks, owls, and buzzards. I think that's all right. I wonder if I shall see my buzzards that were nesting in the pine tree for 2 years. Scores of buzzards used to be seen soaring over my hilltop field in Devon, near the Atlantic coast, towards sunset. Tiers of 5, 6, 7, on broad, outstretched wings as they rose upon thermals or currents of warm ascending air. Today I can see only one. Songbirds are unheard, except occasionally. In the hedge around my 3 acres, only one robin remained to make a nest this spring. And the peregrine falcons have almost disappeared from their immemorial eyries on ledges of high cliffs in the West Country. When things are at their worst and blackest, light often breaks through. Dead birds which had fed on smaller birds, and mice which had eaten poisoned insects or treated seed were examined. It was seen that the cumulative effect had been fatal. Many who didn't die became sterile. Herons, too, were similarly affected. In Norfolk there were many herons. This is how I described one of them in a story written soon after I left the army in 1919. Old Nog continued to peer. Another movement in water deeper by 2 inches. He waded on legs like stilts and green as rushes, peered low, struck with hardly a splash, transfixed a dab with 2 tips of his beak just opened. Then leisurely spreading his grey veins, he jumped into the wind and beat towards the heronry 4 miles away. Two pairs of eyes watched him. Slowly and heavily old Nog sailed to a branch near his nest. Foot by foot, he stalked over to the nest. The youngsters pulled at his head until he yielded up the fish, the frog, the eel, and all the other contents of his crop. Such robbery had happened to old Nog for many years. Every spring he had fished and toiled all day and half the night, and whenever he flew back to the heronry in the treetops for rest and quiet, the nestlings not only pestered him with their noisiness, but robbed him of his food. Another favourite bird of mine is the barn owl. In Norfolk, I often used to see one quartering the St. John's meadow. Silent flying, gold grey wing wafting barn owl. That's a line in imitation of Gerard Manley Hopkins, the priest poet. I wrote a book with the owls in called The Starborn, and I'm now going to read a bit for you from the first edition. And once again the castle keep stood quiet under the starlight. Keorich the white owl flew through the larches with his mate, veered on his wide wings, and flapped away towards Oaten Hill. He was hungry, for the gale had prevented him from hearing the rustle and claw tip of mice in the grass, and since sunset he'd eat only a young rat and an airy mouse, which is a bat. He continued the quartering of the fields he knew so well, staring and listening. A mouse footfall was heard in the big ear cavities hidden by close, short feathers. He appeared downwards to the place of movement. He dropped with taloned feet spread for the clutch. I had tame white owls as a boy, and later, after the Great War, when I became an author, I began to use one as a colophon, or trademark, at the end of my books. But where are the white owls today? Very rare, I fear. The barn owl is the farmer's friend, killing many hundreds of mice, voles and rats during the year. But barns and old farm buildings, the traditional homes of the white owl, are coming down as farms are grouped together with other farms to make more economic units. Autumn again, morning gossamers strung with dew like silvery dust shot. Later the winds set adrift the shining thistle seeds which floated away in warm currents of air to settle along the paths of the wind. Goldfinches, birds of the heaths, the royal-coloured King Harrys of East Anglia, came in twittering flocks to the breck, for thistle seeds were their favourite food. Meanwhile, old Nog was back, waiting for eels. A dragonfly makes a last flight and flies unsuspecting into his maw. Watching for the giveaway movement of a grasshopper's sudden flick between the meadow grasses. And in the autumn, too, come the partridge coveys, roosting in the late afternoon, forming themselves into a rough circle, like the 8th Army tanks in the North African desert, their beaks pointing outwards, the ears alert against attack. I started this tirade with the fate of English hedgerows, 5,000 miles of them vanishing each year. To those who have known hedges all their lives, this is a wilting thought. Just consider the little facts of history which can be read in a hedge. Those with many different kinds of tree and shrub were probably planted as long ago as Saxon times. Hedges are vital in supporting wildlife. They are the motorways, the main roads, the lanes along which bird and animal traffic move in safety across the countryside. Where are they to nest, take cover and feed if there are no hedges? Just think of the many varieties of birds, that use hedges. I love the partridge. It is, or was, the spirit of Britain's arable land. The rabbit was imported originally, so was the pheasant. But perdix, to give the little brown partridge its Latin name, belongs here. Let us go with nature. That is the crying necessity today.
We must respect the topsoil which gives us our food. What the Greeks called Erda, the earth mother, and here in Norfolk still some talk about the mother. For in destroying the mother or the soil that gives us our life, we are destroying ourselves.
Come on. Come on.
Let us help the farmer, subsidize the farmer, so that the countryside and its wild flora and fauna can remain as a social amenity. Above all, let us restore the hedgerows and create the right environment so that 4 birds or beasts can live where only 2, perhaps 1 alone, exists today. The old farming saying holds sempiternal truth. Live as though you're going to die tomorrow, but farm your land as though you're going to live forever. The farmer is the custodian of his land, our land if you like, so give him his due, so that our children and their children's heritage of wild flowers and wild life shall not perish before our very eyes.